Hello, in this lesson we are going to start creating a projectile actor that's going to be used as a projectile that will be continuously fired from a cannon that we're going to be building in a separate lesson. Okay, so we're going to start this lesson by creating a new actor. Let's come inside the blueprints folder and then inside our actors folder. Inside here, let's create a new folder and let's name this projectiles. And then inside this folder, let's create a new blueprint class and let's make it an actor and let's name this BP underscore projectile. And let's open up this blueprint. Now let's take a look at the components that we're going to need for this projectile. Our projectile class is going to be fairly simple. We're going to need a sphere collision component, and this is going to be the root component. And then we need a static mesh component, and we're going to assign a sphere mesh to it. And we're also going to add a new component that we haven't taken a look at yet, and this is the projectile movement component. The projectile movement component allows an actor to continuously move like it's been shot from a gun or from a cannon. So your challenge right now is to add these components, and with your static mesh component, when you assign the sphere mesh, make sure to assign a material to it as well. So pause the video here, and then once you've added your components, come back to the lesson and we can carry on. Okay, so let's add in our collision components. This is going to be a sphere collision. We can name this collision component. And we want to make this the root component. So let's click and drag it up onto the default scene root to make it the root. Now we want to add in a static mesh component, but we also want it to have a sphere mesh applied. And there's a trick here. We can add in a new component and we can just grab the sphere components here. This is actually a static mesh component, but it automatically applies a sphere mesh to it. Let's just call this mesh. Now, let's scale this down so it's a bit smaller than our collision sphere here. We're going to disable the collision of this mesh because we don't need it, because we're going to make our collision component handle all the collision for us. And of course, we want to apply a material to this. I'm going to come back to the starter content and then inside the materials folder, and I'm going to select one of these materials. I'm going to grab the metal gold, and I'm going to maximize this and just assign it by using the selected asset from the content browser. And the final thing we need to add here is the projectile movement component. We can add a new component and we can just type in projectile and we can grab the projectile movement just there. And if we select the projectile movement, we can see all the properties for it on the details panel. Now there's quite a few different properties on the details panel for this projectile movement component. We're just going to focus in on the projectile section, and we're only going to use two properties here. The first property is the initial speed, and this is in centimeters per second. And the second property is the projectile gravity, and we're going to disable the projectile gravity because when our projectile moves throughout the world, we don't want it to fall or dip over time. So I want my projectile to move throughout the world at about 5 meters per second. So I'm going to change the initial speed here to 500. And we want to disable the projectile gravity. So we can take the projectile gravity here and we can change it to 0 to disable it. Now let's come back to our level and let's drag out our projectile blueprint into our level. Now we want to play the game and see the projectile moving, but we don't actually have to hit play. We can drop down the arrow next to play and we can hit simulate. Simulating the game runs the game as if it's playing, but we don't have to possess a pawn, so we can still move around the editor as usual. So when we simulate the game, we see the projectile is moving. Let's rotate the projectile because we're going to be using the projectile kind of going from one wall to the other. We're going to use it as kind of like a blockade for the player that they have to pass. But notice if the projectile keeps going, it's going to go past the wall, it's actually going to go through the wall, and it just keeps continuously going. So I have a challenge for you right now to fix this. Your collision component is currently set to only overlap actors, so I want you to change the collision preset to block all, and then add some blueprint code to destroy the actor when it hits something. So pause here and give this challenge a good go, and then when you think you're ready, come back to the lesson and we can continue. Okay, so our first step here is to select our collision component, and we're going to change its collision preset from overlap all dynamic to block all. Now for the blueprint code, there's two different ways we could create an event that's generated when this actor hits something or when our components hit something. We can scroll down when we have the component selected and we can grab an event from here. There is an on component hit event that we can add. Or we can come into the event graph, we can right click and we can type in event hit and we can get the event hit just here. So we're simply going to hit something, we can drag this out and call destroy actor. So now when the projectile collides with something, our event here will execute the destroy actor function, making the projectile disappear. So let's come back to our level and see the result when we simulate. We can see that the projectile disappears, and if we pay close attention to the world outliner, we can even see it gets listed as a destroyed actor. Okay, so this is a very basic projectile we currently have, but in the next lesson, we're going to start creating our cannon that's going to continuously fire these projectiles. So when you're ready, I'll see you in the next lesson. Hey, and welcome to this lesson where we're going to learn how to import 3D models that are in an FBX format into Unreal Engine 4. We're also going to use these models to create our cannon actor. Okay, so we need a good visual representation of our cannon. So in order to achieve this, we are going to be importing some custom 3D models. Let's start by creating a new folder in the content browser called Meshes. And inside this folder, we want to create a subfolder called Canon. And inside this Canon folder, we can import our meshes. Now, I already have the Canon meshes on my machine here, and these files are in an FBX format. FBX is an acronym for Filmbox, and this is one of the main formats to use when importing meshes and models into Unreal Engine 4. So I want you just to pause here for a moment and navigate to the Resources tab for this lecture on Udemy. On the Resources, you'll find these two models that you can download. So pause here, download them onto your machine, and then let's continue. So with your Canon models downloaded, we can add these to our project by selecting both of them, and we can click and drag them into the content browser in Unreal. And when we release, it brings up the FBX import options. Now there's many import settings here that can be adjusted to affect how a model is imported, but we aren't going to be going through each and every one of these settings right now. We just want to focus on getting our Canon into Unreal. Luckily, all of these settings are good to go, just apart from two. And we don't want to create any unnecessary assets when importing these models. So before importing, the two settings we want to turn off or uncheck are the import materials and import texture settings. Just make sure these two are not checked. To import a model, we can hit import, but remember we're importing two separate files here. We're importing two models. We want to hit import all and use these import settings for both of the models. So your challenge right now is to import the Canon FBX files into Unreal, and when importing these files, make sure to uncheck import materials and textures. So pause here, and once you have your FBX files imported, we can continue on. Okay, so I'm going to hit import all. So once imported, we can see that they are static meshes, just like how we've been using throughout this course. We have the Canon base, and we also have the Canon that will sit in the base. So even though these are separate assets, these two meshes share the same pivot point. If we select both meshes and drag them out at the same time, we can see that they come out into our level connected. Now these assets have no default materials, but we can use the starter content to apply some default materials to them. Let's open up one of the meshes. Let's start with the Canon. With the mesh open, we can see the material slot here, and we can type and search in this filter for some materials. I'm going to search for metal, and these are the metal materials from the starter content. For the canon, I'm going to grab the chrome material, and for the canon base, I'm going to grab, see what metal we can grab here. I'm going to grab the burnished steel. Okay, we can close this, and we can remove our projectile here, and we can see the results of our canon here now with the materials. So I encourage you to try different materials for your canon, and make sure to share the results in this lecture's discussions that you can find in the resources tab for this lecture. But right now, I have another challenge for you. I want you to create a blueprint actor for your canon. Add the two meshes we imported as components for the canon, and make sure to make the canon base mesh the root component. So pause here and create your canon blueprint. Then once you've done this, we can continue. Okay, so I want to remove these static meshes I dragged into the level because I'm going to create a blueprint for our canon. We can come to the blueprints folder, inside the actors folder, and we can create a new folder here named canons, or just canon. Inside this folder, we can right click and create a new blueprint class, and we want it to be an actor. And I'm just going to name this BP underscore canon. And let's open up this blueprint and let's add the static meshes to it. I'm going to add a new component. It's going to be a static mesh component, and this is going to be the canon base, and I also want this to be the root component, so I'm going to click and drag it up onto the default scene root. Now with the mesh selected, I can drop down the static mesh slot and I can choose the canon base to assign it there. And I'm also going to add in another static mesh component, and this is going to be the canon itself. And we can see it's already a child of the canon base because the canon base is the root component. So the canon is going to be our canon static mesh, and this is looking good. We can hit compile and save here and close this, and we can drag our mesh onto the wall, and this is what it's going to look like. We can hold Alt and we can click and drag to duplicate, and we're going to be placing some canons across our walls here. So that wraps up this lesson. We now know how to import FBX files into Unreal Engine 4. In the next lesson, we're going to be making our cannon start firing our projectile actors. So when you're ready, I'll see you there.